Let's imagine you have a choice between two options. Option A, you receive $500, and option B, you have a 50% chance of receiving $1,000 and a 50% chance of receiving nothing. Which would you do? Well, if you're like most people, you probably chose option A, which makes you risk averse. However, if we flip that around a little bit, let's look at the same scenario framed a little bit differently. Option A, you immediately lose $500, and option B, you have a 50% chance of losing $1,000 and a 50% chance of losing nothing. Which would you do in this scenario? Well, if you're like most people, you're going to be in this situation choosing option B, which means you're risk seeking. What they found is that people tend to be risk averse when choice is framed as a gain, but are risk seeking when that same choice is framed as a loss. Research around framing and how it impacts our decision making has been done for decades, most notably by Tversky and Simonson, and not just in hypothetical situations. Consider the following. In consumer decision making, positive frame versus negative frame. Positive frame for ground beef, 75% lean meat, versus a negative frame, 25% fat. Which one would you choose? Well, the study shows that most people overwhelmingly chose 75% lean versus 25% fat, even though the products are obviously identical. So this shows really how important framing is in decision making, especially in the context of consumer goods. Now, as coaches and leaders, we can tap into that power of framing. In fact, that's what we're doing inside of this video, where we cover the top 10 framing techniques to empower you and your clients. And I want you to stick around to the end because I'll show you how to put all of this together. And in the description below, you'll see a link to access a free resource called Framing for Success with 25 essential framing techniques for coaches and for leaders. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at the top 10 frames that are also included inside of that free resource, beginning with number 10, which is the outcome frame. Now, the outcome frame is a really important one because as coaches, as leaders, we want to focus on the desired outcomes. That's what it's all about. Rather than focus on the problems, we want to focus on what do we want. And the values that are coming across are goal orientation and results, because that's really what frames do. Frames are really directing our attention to what's important to us, otherwise known as values. And so how do we do that? We can simply ask a question. What is the ultimate outcome that you are aiming for? Not just the short term, but the long-term ultimate outcome, because that's where all decisions really should be made from. As Stephen Covey says in the 7 Habits for Highly Effective People, begin with the end in mind. And that's what the outcome frame really is all about. Number 9 is the benefit frame. So once we identify the outcome, we can then focus on how it's going to actually benefit them. Focus on the benefits of the new choice or the behavior that they want to do. The values we're bringing up here are positivity, motivation, and connecting to what is the ROI I'm going to get on this specific action I'm going to take. Even though I might have some fear, some anxiety, some stress, some uncertainty, there's benefit on the other side of this, and that's what I want to focus on to tap into that motivation. How do we do that? We can ask a question. What are the potential benefits of taking this action? Now, you may know that there are two motivators in life. That is the desire to experience pleasure and the need to avoid pain. So while we can identify the benefits, we can also get connected to our next one, which is the opportunity cost frame. This is not focused on the benefit, but what we will lose if we don't take a certain action. So the opportunity cost frame is emphasizing what they might be missing out on by not taking an action. This values awareness, paying attention to things they might otherwise be ignoring, and prioritizing really what they need to focus on to achieve the outcome that we already previously set. To tap into that, you can ask a question such as, what might you be missing out on if you don't choose this path? To really focus on the opportunity cost of not taking action. Now, why these frames work is we're asking questions, so we're minimizing resistance by simply asking a question, planting a seed, and ideally we're connecting to the client or team member's values, which is actually related to number 7. We can also go to values directly with a values frame. Evaluate how actions or decisions align with the client's values. So in this case, we're looking at values alignment and integrity overall. How do we do this? How does this decision align with your core values? Is this decision really representative of what's important to you in this area of life? Now, beyond values, values are some of the deepest part of our unconscious programming. There's another level that we can go to, which is number 6, which is identity frame. Now, it's quite often considered that values the deepest level of programming, but if you really think about it, people quite often value their identity even more than their values, which is why we see all the time people make decisions around identity at the expense of their own values. So when you're tapping into number 6, identity frame, you're really getting into some deep level of motivation to make sure that this is in alignment for them. At this point, we're trying to align actions and decisions with the client's self-concept. Who are they as a person? What is their self-concept? How do they view themselves? And make sure that it's actually in alignment. So we're looking at self-concept and authenticity. To tap into this one, we can ask, does this choice really reflect who you are and who you want to become? So we can tap into the present moment as well as perhaps the avatar self, who they want to become on an ideal level. Now we're ready for the top 5, beginning with the choice frame. And with the choice frame, what this one does is it helps identify options for clients to empower them with a sense of control and autonomy. We feel powerful when we have choices, and we feel powerless when we don't have choices. So we're bringing in autonomy, we're bringing in control, we're bringing a sense of empowerment to bring that power back from whoever or whatever they've given their power to. To tap into this one, we're going to ask questions such as, what options do you have in the scenario? What other choices are available? How else can we approach this that we haven't looked at before? Helping your client or your team member notice that there's always more options available than what they're looking at gives them a sense of possibility and abundance, and truly a sense of empowerment. Number 4 is experimentation frame. And this is really a fun one because it changes the energy from a have to a get to, and really taps into the power of curiosity. We're going to be framing actions as experiments to reduce fear of failure. When we think that it's all in, like this, all my eggs are in one basket and this has to work, it creates a lot of anxiety and a lot of pressure. But if we just look at it as an opportunity to learn, to grow, and get better in the future, as an experiment, if you will, that reduces anxiety, reduces fear of failure, and gets people to take action. So we're focusing on learning, we're looking at innovation, and how we can tap into this one is ask questions such as, hey, what can we learn from this, treating this as an experiment? This allows us to change the frame on it, change the energy on it, and reduce the anxiety, and actually ultimately decide and take action. And number 3 is an extreme frame. Now, an extreme frame, you may not always use this one, but if your client has an objection, it's one that I use all the time to help the client get a better sense of reality. And let's take a look at what that looks like. What we do in this one is we exaggerate an objection, a problem, or some obstacle that the client has that's a mental, perhaps emotional obstacle that exists. We exaggerate to an extreme to test the client's thinking and help them see that this isn't always true, hasn't always been true, might not always be true in the future, to really point out that this is just a limiting belief, and then we can work through that limiting belief. This values clarity and critical thinking, and actually really looking at the data rather than making assumptions and generalizations. Let's say, as an example, you're working with someone and they want to start a business, and their limiting belief is that, I can't start a business because I've never started one before. Well, of course, as the coach, as the confidant, you know that that is ridiculous, because if that were true, then no one would ever start a business, because the prerequisite would be you'd have to have already started a business in order to start your first business, which doesn't make any sense. So you might respond with, so if I understand you correctly, you're telling me that the reason you can't start a business is because you've never done one before? Is that correct? And in hearing it reflected back to them, then obviously they say, okay, well, that obviously doesn't make any sense. So we take the objection, we take the concern they have, and we blow it out to the extreme to point out how it's not true in all conditions, which means it's really not true. It's just a limiting belief, and we can actually let that go. So once we've gotten over that obstacle, another frame that you might find useful is the challenge frame. The challenge frame is shifting the focus by framing situations as challenges or tests to be overcome, as opposed to problem. This isn't a problem. This is a challenge. This is an opportunity. So this focuses on motivation, focuses on growth, and you can tap into this by asking, how can you view this as a challenge to grow from? How would that shift your experience if you just looked at this as a challenge that you can overcome? And finally, the number 1 frame for coaches and leaders, the learning frame. The learning frame is something that you probably use all the time, and what it does is it transforms negative experiences or setbacks into learning opportunities. This values resilience and growth, and this is the basic principle in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, that there's no such thing as failure, there's only feedback. In other words, it's all about learning. And of course, one way to tap into this one is to simply ask something along the lines of, what positive lessons can you learn from the situation? That's a present situation, or you can put it out into the future if they haven't taken the action yet. What positive lessons do you hope to gain from this, whether you succeed or not? That's a powerful way to focus it on the future, to help people lower the threshold of the pain that they're experiencing, the fear, the anxiety, the stress, and focus on what they might gain, either through a win or through a learning. And from that perspective, it's a win-win. They're going to win. Either they get the result or they get a learning, which makes them even better for the future. So that's the top 10 frames for coaches and for leaders. But before we wrap up, I want to talk about how to put all of this together, because that's when the magic really happens. Now, all of these are powerful in and of themselves, but when you put them all together, something powerful really happens. When you put them all together in the order that we just did, it actually mirrors what a basic coaching session might actually look like. Think about it. Imagine we start with the outcome. What do you want to achieve? What do you ultimately want to achieve in your life, in your business, in your relationship? Once we get clarity on the outcome, then we're focusing on the benefit. What do you hope to gain from this? What's the benefit to you? We're connecting to that positive motivation. Then we're going to focus on the other side. What is the opportunity cost? What's it going to cost you if you don't make this decision right now and start getting the ball moving in the direction that you want it to go? Then we can connect even more deeply to values. Why is this important to you? How does this connect to your values? Make sure it's fully aligned, not only with their values, but also with their identity, who they are now, and ultimately who they want to be with the avatar self. From there, once we get clarity on the future, then we can start looking at what are the choices that they have in front of them right now, and make sure that they feel they actually do have choices. As we look at those choices, we can pull in the experiment frame, so we're not overly attached to any one choice. We can just look at it as data. Either we find out what works or we find out what doesn't work, and sometimes that's even more important. From there, if there's any obstacles, mental, emotional, or otherwise, we can take it to the extreme and get rid of those obstacles so that we can move on to the challenge frame and look at this as a challenge, and how excited we get when we think about things as a challenge, and then make sure that we have that learning frame in place no matter what happens, that we can actually win no matter what. So these are the top 10 frames for coaches and for coach leaders. So go ahead and watch this video again, or write these down, or more simply download that resource so you have access to these as you go forward. And most importantly, go out there and practice. And if you really want to take your framing skills to the next level, you're going to want to look at pre-framing and the video on screen, or take a look at the other videos in the series here. Thanks for watching. Until next time, develop yourself, empower others, and lead by example.